There is a figure who walks through the Old Testament that most readers move past without ever quite noticing how strange he is. He finds a runaway servant girl alone in the desert and speaks to her as if he already knows the number of her descendants. He stops a father's hand in mid-air above his own bound son on a mountain. He steps out of a fire that will not consume the bush it burns in and tells a fugitive shepherd to take off his sandals, because the ground he is standing on has become holy. He wrestles a grown man to exhaustion beside a river at night and refuses, point blank, to give his name. He stands in front of an army commander with a sword drawn, and when asked whose side he is on, answers neither. Every single time, the biblical writers call him the same thing, malak YHWH. The messenger of the Lord. And every single time, something breaks the pattern a simple messenger should follow. He does not merely deliver messages. He speaks in the first person as God. He accepts worship without correcting anyone for offering it. He promises things only the Creator of the universe has the authority to promise. And when someone finally works up the courage to ask his name directly, he refuses, not with silence, but with a question of his own. As if the asking itself were somehow beside the point. Then, after centuries of these appearances scattered across Genesis, Exodus, Judges, Joshua, and beyond, something happens. The moment the New Testament opens, he is simply gone. Not one single unambiguous appearance of the malak YHWH occurs anywhere in the Gospels, Acts, or the Epistles, in the same form he took for the 1500 years before. The writers who once could not stop describing him suddenly have nothing more to say. This is the story of that figure, who he was, why the biblical authors seem to be building a case about him across centuries of separate books. And why he did not so much disappear as show up one final time, permanently, and never need to appear that way again. Start with a small but important correction most English readers never learn. The Hebrew word behind angel does not mean what English speakers now assume it means. There is no separate Hebrew word for the winged, halo-wearing being that shows up on greeting cards. The word is simply malak, and it means, quite plainly, messenger. It is the same kind of word used for a human courier carrying a letter between two kings, or a diplomat delivering an ultimatum from one camp to another. Nothing about the word itself specifies wings, or glowing light, or even a non-human nature. A malak is, at its root, whoever is sent to deliver something on someone else's authority. So when the Hebrew Bible introduces a figure called the malak YHWH, the messenger of Yahweh, it is not necessarily introducing a category of heavenly creature at all. It is introducing a role, someone who arrives, again and again, carrying the full weight of the sender's own authority. This particular phrase, malak YHWH, appears roughly 65 times across the Hebrew scriptures, from Genesis all the way through the post-exilic prophet Zechariah, and almost every single time it shows up, the text does something deliberately unsettling. The messenger arrives to deliver a word from the Lord. And then, mid-conversation, without any narrative seam or explanation, begins speaking as the Lord himself, in the first person, using language no created being would ever be permitted to use about itself. This is not sloppy writing. Across centuries, across multiple authors, across entirely different literary genres, narrative, poetry, legal code, prophecy, the same startling pattern holds. A messenger arrives. The messenger speaks as the one who, and the humans standing in the scene react not with mild confusion, but with the specific, bodily terror of people who believe they have just come face to face with God himself, and may not survive the encounter. Whatever this figure is, the biblical writers are not confused about him. They are building something, a portrait, assembled one appearance at a time, across nearly the entire length of the Old Testament. The very first appearance of the malak YHWH in the entire Bible happens not to a patriarch, not to a prophet, but to an Egyptian slave girl running for her life through the wilderness. Her name is Hagar. She is Sarah's servant, pregnant by Abraham at Sarah's own insistence, and now fleeing Sarah's harsh treatment with nowhere to go. Genesis chapter 16 finds her collapsed by a spring in the desert, alone, with no protector, no plan, and, in the ancient world's harshest math, very little reason to expect she or her unborn child would survive. And there, in the middle of nowhere, the malak YHWH finds her. Not the other way around. She has not built an altar, offered a sacrifice. He simply arrives, calls her by name, and asks where she has come from and where she is going. The kind of question that assumes an intimate knowledge of her situation before she has explained a single detail of it. He speaks to her the way only Yahweh speaks to anyone in Genesis, making a promise about the sheer number of her offspring. The exact language reserved elsewhere in the book for God's covenant promises to Abraham himself. And Hagar's response is the detail that should stop every careful reader in their tracks. She does not thank a messenger. She gives God a new name. You are a God of seeing, she says, El Roy, for she said, have I also here seen him who sees me? Consider what has just happened. An enslaved, pregnant, runaway foreign woman, alone in the desert, becomes the very first human being in the entire Bible to coin a new name. Not Abraham. Not Sarah. Hagar, a woman with essentially no status in her world, is trusted by the text with theological insight that will outlast her, because the malak YHWH did not merely deliver a message to her. He saw her, in a place and a condition where she believed no one, human or divine, was watching. The pattern set here will repeat throughout the rest of the story. This figure is the one who comes looking. Not waiting in a temple to be sought out through the right rituals by the right people. Finding runaways in the wilderness before they even know to ask for help. The same startling overlap appears again, decades later, in one of the most famous scenes in the entire Hebrew Bible. Moses, a fugitive shepherd tending his father-in-law's flock near Horeb, notices something strange on the mountainside, a bush, engulfed in flame, that never actually burned. Exodus chapter 3 tells us plainly who he sees first. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. The malak YHWH. The messenger. But watch what happens in the very next verse. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush. Not the angel calling. The text has not corrected itself or clarified an earlier mistake. It has simply moved, without any narrative friction at all. From calling this figure the angel of the Lord to calling him, directly, God. And the conversation that follows never distinguishes between the two again for the rest of the scene. The voice from the bush tells Moses to remove his sandals, because the ground has become holy. A category of holiness that, throughout the rest of the Hebrew Bible, applies only to spaces where God's own presence dwells. The voice then identifies itself not as a representative sent on behalf of someone else, but as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Moses' own ancestral covenant God, speaking in the first person about promises made generations earlier. And when Moses finally asks for a name to bring back to Israel, the voice answers with the most theologically loaded self-description in the entire Old Testament, I am who I am. This is not the language of an errand runner. A created messenger, however exalted, does not lay claim to eternal self-existence as his own personal identity. Whatever is speaking from that bush is claiming, in the plainest terms the Hebrew language has available, to be the eternal God of Israel's ancestors. While the narrator, in the very same breath, keeps calling him the malak, the messenger. This same tension surfaces again and again across the Torah. On Mount Moriah, as Abraham's knife is raised above his, it is the angel of the Lord who calls out to stop him, and yet the very next line has that same angel saying, of Abraham's obedience. You have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Not from God, as a separate party the angel represents. From me. The messenger and the sender collapse into the same speaker, mid-sentence, without the text ever pausing to explain how that is possible. If the burning bush shows this figure speaking with divine authority, the story of Jacob at the Jabbok River shows him doing something even stranger, engaging in a physical fight he could have ended instantly, and losing on purpose. Genesis chapter 32 finds Jacob alone at night, the night before a reunion with his estranged brother Esau that he has every reason to fear will end in violence. And there, in the darkness, a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. The narrative gives no introduction. No explanation of where this man came from or why he has chosen this particular night to appear. The struggle goes on for hours, evenly matched enough that neither combatant can force a decisive end. Until, in a single line that reveals exactly how much restraint has been at work the entire time, the man touches Jacob's hip and dislocates it. With what the text implies was barely any effort at all. A being capable of ending an entire night's wrestling match with a single touch has apparently chosen, up to that point, not to. As dawn approaches, the man asks to be released. Jacob, still holding on despite a dislocated hip, refuses to let go without a blessing. And here the conversation takes its strangest turn. The man asks Jacob's name, renames him Israel, for you have striven with God and with men, and have prevailed. And then Jacob, in turn, asks for the man's name in return. The answer he receives is not a name at all. Why is it that you ask my name? The man responds, and blesses him without ever supplying one. Jacob, for his part, has no doubt what has just happened. He names the place Peniel, the face of God. Saying, I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved. The prophet Hosea, centuries later, looking back on this same event, will describe Jacob as having strove with God in one breath and strove with the angel in the very next. The same collapsing of identity seen at the burning bush, now applied retroactively to a wrestling match beside a river. Notice the refusal to name himself. It will not be the last time this figure declines to answer that exact question. And the reason he gives, centuries later in an almost identical scene, will turn out to matter enormously. That almost identical scene arrives generations later, in the book of Judges, to a childless couple named Manoah and his unnamed wife. The malak YHWH appears first to the wife alone, promising a son who will begin to deliver Israel, a son who will grow up to be Samson. When Manoah later prays to see this messenger for himself, the figure returns, and Manoah, still not entirely certain what he is dealing with, asks the exact question Jacob once asked at the Jabbok, "What is your name, so that when your words come true, we may honor you?" The answer, word for word, echoes the refusal at Peniel, "Why do you ask my name, seeing it is wonderful?" The Hebrew word translated wonderful here is pilai, from the same root, Pele, that will resurface centuries later. In one of the most famous messianic prophecies in the entire Hebrew Bible, Isaiah chapter 9. His name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. The very word this figure uses to explain why he will not disclose his identity is the same word Isaiah later attaches directly to a coming child who will bear the titles of God himself. Manoah and his wife then watched the messenger ascend in the flame of their sacrifice, an exit no ordinary created being performs. And Manoah, gripped with sudden terror, cries out to his wife, "We shall surely die, for we have seen God." This is not a figure of speech. It reflects the settled Israelite conviction, stated outright elsewhere in the Torah, that no one can see God directly and live. Manoah is not saying he saw an impressive angel. He is saying, in the plainest terms available to him, that he believes he has just looked directly at God. And is astonished to still be breathing. The same fear appears a generation earlier, almost word for word, in the story of Gideon in Judges chapter 6. The malak YHWH sits under an oak tree, calls the frightened, hiding Gideon a mighty man of valor. A title that, at that exact moment in the narrative, could not sound less true. And, after a miraculous sign involving fire consuming an offering directly from the rock itself, vanishes from Gideon's sight. Gideon's own reaction mirrors Manoah's precisely, "Alas, O Lord God! For now I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." And God, not a separate messenger, is the one who answers him directly, "Peace be to you. Do not fear, you shall not die." Across two separate stories, two separate centuries, two entirely different tribal settings, the same reflex appears in ordinary Israelites confronted with this figure. An instinctive, bodily certainty that they have just encountered God directly, strong enough to make them fear for their lives on the spot. One final Old Testament appearance completes the pattern, and it arrives at the most tactically tense moment imaginable. The night before Israel's assault on the fortified city of Jericho. Joshua, walking near the city under cover of darkness, looks up and sees a man standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. This is not a passive messenger waiting to deliver an announcement. This is a military figure, armed, positioned directly in Joshua's path. Joshua, commander of Israel's own army, does the only sensible thing a commander can do when confronted by an armed stranger on the eve of battle. He asks which side this man is fighting for. "Are you for us, or for our adversaries?" The answer refuses the entire premise of the question. "No," the figure says, "but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come. Not I am for you. Not even I am against your enemies." He has not come to take a side in Israel's war. He has come, the text implies, because the war itself, like everything else Joshua is about to do at Jericho, belongs to him. And Joshua's job is not to enlist his help but to submit to his command. Joshua's response confirms exactly what kind of figure he believes he is looking at. He falls face down to the ground and worships him. A response the entire rest of the Hebrew Bible reserves exclusively for God, and one that any genuinely created angel, elsewhere in Scripture, immediately refuses and corrects. The angel who later appears to John in the book of Revelation, offered the same posture of worship, responds instantly, "You must not do that. I am a fellow servant with you. Worship God." No such correction ever comes at Jericho. Instead, the commander's next words mirror, almost exactly, the words spoken to Moses at the burning bush, "Take off your sandals from your feet. For the place where you are standing is holy." Joshua does exactly that. A created being who accepted worship without immediately correcting it would be, by the Bible's own repeated standard elsewhere, committing one of the gravest violations imaginable. This commander accepts it in silence, and then issues the same command once given to Moses out of a burning bush. Centuries after these stories were first written down, Jewish scholars translating and paraphrasing the Hebrew scriptures into Aramaic. The everyday spoken language of Jews in the land of Israel by the time of Jesus, noticed something in these texts worth wrestling with directly. These Aramaic paraphrases, called the Targums, were read aloud in synagogues alongside the original Hebrew. And at many of the passages where the Hebrew text describes God acting, speaking, or appearing in a way the Targumists found theologically delicate. Too direct, too physical, too intimate for the transcendent, unseeable God of Israel to be doing personally, the Aramaic translation substitutes a specific term. The Memra, meaning simply the word. Where the Hebrew of Genesis says God walked in the garden, the Targum has the Memra of the Lord walking in the garden. Where Jacob wrestles at the Jabbok, one Targumic tradition has him wrestling face to face with the angel of the Lord and reflecting on it accordingly. The Memra, across these Aramaic translations, functions almost exactly like the malak YHWH functions in the Hebrew text itself. A way of describing God acting directly in the world, present and personal, while still preserving some careful linguistic distance from the fully transcendent Father. It is, in other words, an entire tradition of Jewish biblical interpretation, developed independently of Christianity, already reaching for a word concept. To describe exactly the kind of figure this documentary has been tracing from Hagar's spring to Joshua's sword. This is precisely the tradition a Jewish writer named John appears to be picking up when he opens his Gospel with words no accidental echo of Genesis could produce. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Greek term John uses, logos, has its own rich philosophical background in the Greek-speaking world. But for a Jewish audience already accustomed to hearing the Memra spoken of exactly this way in the synagogue every week, John's opening lines land as something more specific than pure Greek philosophy. He is claiming that the personal, active, world-engaging presence of God that Jewish tradition already had language for. The Word, the Memra, the malak YHWH who kept showing up throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, has now done something it had never done before. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, John writes a few verses later, using a verb that literally means to pitch a tent, to tabernacle. The same word used centuries earlier for the portable sanctuary where God's own glory once dwelt among Israel in the wilderness. The one who found Hagar at the spring, who spoke from the bush, who wrestled Jacob at the river, who stood armed before Joshua. The one who kept showing up, again and again, in fire and flesh and shadow, without ever settling permanently into any one place, has now, John insists, arrived to stay. This is why the malak YHWH vanishes so completely from the pages of the New Testament. Not because the biblical writers lost interest in him. Not because the tradition simply died out. But because, in the Christian reading this entire study has been tracing, the very thing every one of these Old Testament appearances was pointing toward finally happened. A figure who spoke as God without ceasing to be sent by God, who accepted worship no created being may accept, who refused again and again to give a name because the name itself was, in his own word, too wonderful. That figure did not need to keep appearing temporarily in a bush, at a riverbank, on a battlefield. He appeared once, permanently, in Bethlehem, and stayed. Look back across every scene this study has traced. Hagar, alone and unseen by everyone else in her world, found by a God who sees. Moses, standing before fire that would not consume what it burned, hearing the same voice claim both messenger status and eternal self-existence in the same conversation. Jacob, refusing to release his grip until he received a blessing from a figure who would not give his name. Manoah and Gideon, certain they had glimpsed God directly and would not survive it. Joshua, falling face down in worship before a commander who accepted it without correction. Every one of these encounters shares the same signature, someone who is unmistakably God, standing in front of ordinary, frightened human beings. In a form they could see, hear, and sometimes even wrestle. The Hebrew Scriptures never fully resolve, in so many words, exactly who this figure is. They simply keep describing him, appearance after appearance, century, building a portrait too consistent, too deliberate, to be an accident of translation or a scribal habit. Isaiah 63 looks back over the whole span of Israel's history and offers what may be the closest thing the Old Testament gives to a direct summary. In all their affliction he was afflicted, and the angel of his presence saved them. Not a distant angel dispatched from a safe remove. A messenger who was afflicted alongside the people he came to save. Present with them, inside their suffering, long before anyone had a name to put to exactly who that meant. The angel of the Lord did not disappear. According to the very gospel that reaches back into that older Aramaic tradition of the Memra. He simply stopped needing to come and go. He showed up one final time, took on flesh instead of flame, pitched his tent among the very people he had been quietly finding in deserts and wrestling by riverbanks all along. And this time, he stayed.